Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, before I introduce my guest this week, just a reminder, as I do always, please do subscribe, won't you? We're going great guns with subscriptions at the moment. We always want more. And so you just do that by clicking on subscribe or going next door to the little bell next door and clicking on that too, and that gives you notifications of all of our programs. Now, I wonder how fearful or how frightened you have felt over the past year. If you have felt that during this period of the pandemic, then there is a book that you should definitely read. It's called A State of Fear: How the UK Government Weaponised Fear During the Covid-19 Pandemic. Here it is. It is a bestseller now. It's in the Sunday Times best-selling charts, and the author of it is Laura Dodsworth, and she is with me now. Thanks for joining us, Laura.
Thank you for having me. What an honour.
It's a pleasure. Laura, before I ask you about the book, you are you're a filmmaker, a photographer. You've in fact published books of your photography of the human form, basically, shall we say. This would seem to be a bit of a departure, and I just wondered, why did you write it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think it could look like it could look like a departure, but there's a couple of answers to that. First of all, we've just lived through the most extraordinary year and a half in British life and politics, and I've reacted to that. There's a sense in which the book is reactionary. Look, I was locked up at home and couldn't go about my normal work. Some very exciting projects were cancelled. But I don't think it's as much of a departure as you'd think. I can perceive quite a trajectory now I look back with hindsight. So although my previous photography books, the work I'm best known for, are about the human form, like you say, bare reality, manhood and womanhood. And there was a Channel 4 documentary that spun off womanhood called 100 Vaginas. Oh, yeah. So people are getting the sense of the type of work it is. The photographs in those projects are really visual signposts through stories about taboos, through the human condition, what makes us female, what makes us male. They're about sexed experience of life. I'm interested in the taboos. And so I think it's not really that surprising for me that when the pandemic started, the thing that I tuned into was fear, because there was a lot of fear in the air. You know, we all felt it one way or another. People were jumping to the side of the pavement and burying their face in hedges to avoid your exhalations as you went past. And epidemics are frightening times, naturally. This is a good thing. You know, we're hardwired to be frightened of infection and illness and, of course, ultimately death. We want to protect ourselves and our loved ones. But given that fear was an open door, one of the tenets of the book is that the government probably didn't need to do so much as open the door and say, after you, and they probably didn't need to use a battering ram. So the book is about how the government leveraged our own fear in order to make people comply with the lockdown regulations, which were an unprecedented change in how we go about our civic, social, business lives. It's about who did that, the tools they used, the impacts of using fear on people. I interviewed people who were quite undone by fear. And most of all, it's really about the ethics. It's about the ethics of fear being weaponized, even if it's supposedly in our best interest, to make us comply with rules during an epidemic.
Can I sort of, let's clarify something actually, Laura. What was your general attitude? What has your general attitude been to the pandemic? I mean, because you know there's a whole host of attitudes out there. Some are going into darker spaces, if you like. But you don't doubt that there is a pandemic or anything like that. I just want to establish the basis of your inquiry.
No, I don't doubt there's a pandemic. That accusation's been levelled at me, which I just think is a complete misunderstanding of the book, its thesis, and me. So when this all started, I remember feeling quite astonished seeing the videos that came out of China. I actually didn't quite buy them, and if you look back now, they are laughable. People standing bolt upright and then falling over like planks and suddenly being surrounded by hazmat suits. You know, if the rest of the world had COVID, then those videos were stunt COVID. But I remember I was quite alarmed. I'm a single parent. I remember thinking, well, what will I do if I'm not allowed to leave the house and I get ill and I can't feed my children? And I remember, you know, getting like a little bit of a cough and thinking, oh my goodness, is this it? Am I about to get COVID? And I remember stocking up on tinned food so my kids would be able to feed themselves if I got ill. So I certainly tuned into the same sorts of fears that everybody did about what the disease would be like and how I would manage in my life. The aim of the book is not to refute at all that COVID is a very serious, nasty disease and epidemic. I switch between using epidemic and pandemic because we don't really have a house style on this yet. This is the first time we've been in one. Pandemic is global, epidemic is country. So in the book, I often use epidemic when I'm focusing on the UK, but I'm not minimising the seriousness when I use the word epidemic. And I don't refute that it has killed people. I actually do think there are serious issues of counting the number of deaths because we changed how we conduct death registrations. There'll be areas of undercounting and overcounting, but the fact is we'll never really know. Excess deaths are probably the most useful measure. So I don't refute that COVID is a pandemic. Then there's so many other areas to go into. That's like a big question. What do I think of different countries' policies? What do I think of lockdown? What do I think of the behavioural psychology approach? The book really focuses on the behavioural psychology approach and specifically fear. However, we did find, the publisher, the editor, that it seemed impossible not to mention lockdown. I kind of wanted to stay away from it because it's not what the book's about. But it's quite hard to extricate all the different policies and not mention some of them. You can't put lockdown in a silo. So I have included an appendix on lockdown, and it's entitled Lockdowns Don't Work. So, you know, get a little idea there. My anti-lockdown colours are nailed quite firmly to the mast.
But I think...
But yeah, the book is focused on fear, and it's focused on that behavioural psychology approach.
But the thing is that lockdowns, of course, absolutely can... enhance fear. I mean, because if people are on their own, they're more likely to get frightened. This point about behavioural psychology, which is, as you say, the point of your book, and which we'll come on to a bit later, is also something called nudge theory and how that works. Was there a point at which the government sort of decided that people weren't frightened enough?
Yes, well, I think many people watching this video will probably already be aware of a document which is now quite infamous. So there were the minutes from the meeting on the 22nd of March, convened by the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, SWYSI for short. And they report into SAGE, the Government Scientific Advisory Group. And what SWYSI do is they answer questions that are put to them by the government. So the question would be, wow, lockdowns are unprecedented. How are we going to make people comply with these rules? There was a lot of nervousness about that. And the minutes are SPIBE's recommendations for how to encourage adherence with the rules. And one of those just extraordinary insights that we get from the document is that they felt we weren't frightened enough. Specifically, they said that people were complacent because they understood the risk of death in their age category was not too great. Because we knew even then in March that COVID is a very age-stratified disease. And as time has gone on, it's become clearer and clearer. It's age-stratified and very patterned according to identifiable clinical conditions. So some people understood they weren't at a great deal of risk. And so the fear was, gosh, if they know that, will they not follow the rules? And so the suggestion was that our sense of perceived threat needed to be elevated. Essentially, they advised the government we had to be frightened. That's among a range of suggestions. But a lot of people did tune into that at the time and think, oh gosh, this is an admission. The government's tried to frighten us. Now, this isn't anything new. This has happened throughout time, and it's happened in other public health campaigns. And it wasn't actually unique to the UK. I do give a few other examples in the book while I focused very much on the UK. So similar documents have emerged in Germany. They were reported in Welt am Sonntag, and those similar papers, which are conversations and leaked emails between government ministers and scientists and behavioural scientists, called the panic papers, actually they go into much more lurid detail about how you could make sure that children will feel guilty if they go out and play and then come back and give the disease to their loved one, and that people would be terrified by seeing images of those who are dying at home, choking, gasping for air, who can't get to hospital. So they really went into some kind of vivid detail about what would scare people into following the rules. There were leaked emails from iSage, so that's the independent equivalent of SAGE in Ireland, about how to use fear to change behaviour and encourage compliance. And actually just today I saw an article come out of Australia where a well-known commentator is saying to encourage vaccine uptake in Australia, they need a campaign that will terrify people, that will frighten people. So the idea of using fear in order to change behaviour during a public health disaster is not a new one, but it's what this book explores in some detail. What was done, how it was done, and how it's impacted us.
You've interviewed everyone from government people, civil service, to members of the public. Were you surprised at what you found about the way they operated? Were you surprised?
Yeah, I have been very surprised by a few things. In retrospect, some of my penny drops seem like very obvious conclusions. One is that the clue is in the word behaviour. Behavioural psychologists are about behaviour. They want to change your behaviour, and they will do that leveraging emotions, and fear is the most powerful of emotions. It's really just about changing how you behave. It's not about making you feel good. Another big conclusion for me was that behavioural psychology is very deeply embedded in government. I hit lots of brick walls in the research, which I detail in the book. And I got as far as I could in a limited time frame during the pandemic. Books in the future are going to be able to go into more detail than I have done, I hope. But the brick walls are interesting in themselves. So we have behavioural scientists in the Cabinet Office, in NHS, in Public Health England, in RICU, the Research Information Communication Unit, in the Counter Disinformation Unit. There's the 77th Brigade, which is part of the Army. There's GCHQ, and there's SWYSI, the behavioural psychologists who are not employed by the government, but convene on this voluntary panel in order to advise them. The behavioural psychologists are everywhere. Now, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think perhaps when they were doing more innocuous things that seemed more innocent and had very obvious public health benefits, we didn't really have our eye on the ball. I know there are others who have kind of crossed swords with them before and drawn attention to it. But I think the last year really, really shines a light on how effective behavioural psychology is and how destabilising the weaponisation of fear is. So there have been calls in the past for public consultation because behavioural psychology has the power to change your very personality, and we've seen that in the last year. And it also changes your relationship with the government. If you pay taxes for the government to provide certain services, that's all well and good. That's what we expect. We have a transactional relationship. But when you're paying taxes to be subliminally manipulated without your knowledge or consent, that changes the relationship. So there have been calls for consultation before, going back well over a decade, but we've never had that consultation. And it's where I get to at the end of the book, that having found out how deeply embedded behavioural science is and how the government relates to us, the need for consultation it's intense, and nothing has shown that as much as the last year. It's a very paternalistic discipline, in my opinion. There's one document that talks about how it helps you lock up the biscuit tin. You want to tackle obesity, help people lock up the biscuit tin. I don't actually really want anyone to lock up the biscuit tin. Give me some facts and figures. I'll decide what I eat and how I live my life and how healthy I want to be. But they didn't lock up the biscuit tin in the last year. They locked us up. Yeah. And the government chose to rely upon behavioural psychology because it didn't trust the British public to follow the rules and to behave sensibly and to have a sensible risk calculation. That changes our relationship with the government and with each other.
I remember that there was, I think it was an ad, which, this is quite early on, which actually said, it's not just old people, everybody of all ages, basically they are susceptible to getting infected by this disease. That was just simply untrue, wasn't it? I mean, would that have been a product of the behavioural unit, as it were, or behavioural psychology? Because it seems to me it's the sort of thing that governments have kind of always done, that kind of thing, that sort of hyperbole.
Yeah, I think they have. I mean, it's the same if you look back to the AIDS campaign. At the moment, there's a lot of kind of backslapping, saying how great the AIDS campaign was. I think there are different perspectives on that. It did spread fear and alarm among populations who were never really at risk of HIV, for instance. And perhaps the grassroots organisations who encouraged needle exchanges arguably did more. But undoubtedly, this is not a new thing. Like I say, there's nothing particularly outlier or left field about suggesting governments use fear to manage public health or all kinds of situations. But the advertising was quite startling. I mean, if you look back at it now, if you look back at all of it, I think you'll be quite astonished. There was an early ad that showed an NHS worker in full PPE. She's wearing a surgical mask, but it looks like a gas mask from the war. This is not like the little cloth things people are wearing on the streets. And it's grainy and it's dystopian. And underneath it said, if you go out, you can spread it, people will die. So it's very, very hardcore. You are at risk, but more importantly, you are the risk. Now, there were other ads. I remember one of some teenage boys in a park, and it said, COVID kills. Well, to be fair, COVID has not killed many teenage boys in parks. There was another one that said, don't let a cup of coffee cost lives. I remember really finding that one quite objectionable because for many people at the time, one of the lifelines in those bleak lockdown winter months was going out with a friend to get a coffee and taking a walk in a park. And let's not forget, that was never illegal. Plus, it's a completely normal social thing to do. And we are social creatures. Yep. We need to see people. So the idea that going out for a cup of coffee could kill people would really dissuade people from going about something that might be how they're hanging on to their mental health. It's a completely normal social activity, plus was never illegal. But the other thing that does is it deflects criticism away from policies and politicians and onto people. So if you've gone for a cup of coffee, maybe that's why people died. Maybe it's because lots of other people were transferred from hospitals to care homes. So it doesn't just create fear, it also creates ill will and blame, and it deflects criticism from where it's probably better directed.
Do you think as well, for it to work well, do you think as well that are we more susceptible to being frightened now, do you think? I mean, it seems to me that you've got to have a pretty kind of receptive market for this stuff, in a way. Do you think that people generally are easier frightened than maybe they once would have been?
Yes, I think so, but I'm definitely not the best expert to answer on this. And others have done it already. Frank Furedi, for instance, with his books on fear. I think the terrain was fertile, absolutely fertile. I think that there are trends in public health that feed into this. Let's not forget, epidemics are frightening. It was correct, normal, and natural that people were frightened when it started as well. And I think that we're blown about by our passions. That was a quote actually from Patrick Fagan, a behavioural psychologist I interviewed for the book. He said, we're blown about by our passions, and part of it is because of social media. It won't come as any great surprise, but I report on a couple of studies in the book that show that when you consume more media, you become more frightened. Yes. And also social media makes messages spread in a way that becomes sequentially more frightening. So I think there are lots of factors at play. But aside from whatever made the terrain more fertile for fear, we had daily press briefings. We've had a daily dashboard which shows deaths but not recoveries, and hospital admissions but not discharges. How many people have died from COVID every day, but not how many people tend to die every day anyway, or from other diseases. I mean, even now we're talking about how many people are dying from COVID, and they're very small numbers, but nobody's talking about how many excess deaths there are at home from heart conditions. So everything is without context, which creates what's called the availability bias. It means your brain is focusing on COVID deaths. And so there's been a barrage of that since this all started last March. Also, there's been a lot of fear-mongering through the media, and some of that becomes directly from, press briefings.
Yeah.
Some of it could come from editorial and proprietor bias. Some of it could come because of clickbait, because fear sells. If it bleeds, it leads. Some of it could come from the fact that the NHS, the Public Health England government, were two of the biggest advertisers in the country last year, which may have affected editorial integrity. There's a lot of different factors that will feed into that, but the government and the media have really fueled a fear that started with a natural fear of an epidemic. And yes, I think the terrain was right for it.
Yes. And it in fact remains so, because, even now going out and about, it's odd actually, Laura, because there is a slightly freer feeling about things than maybe this time last year. But then you come across people like I did today, for example, on the tube coming here. I mean, this woman, I sat on the seat next to her, but she was just recoiling almost into the corner. And I just sort of thought, what state of mind must you have got into to have got that frightened?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So in the book, I outline some of the collateral damages. I give some facts and figures. There's a campaigning group called Recovery that conducted some research with a polling company that found that 15% of people felt their mental health had been affected directly by the government's advertising for COVID. So that's not great. A psychiatrist has just identified a new syndrome and coined the term COVID anxiety syndrome. He has found that 20% of people are left with they're left in too anxious a state. Yeah. So if you think back to the beginning of the pandemic, we were encouraged to do things like stay indoors, like agoraphobics, to wash our hands repeatedly, and to be quite worrying and watchful, which are like OCDs. So these may have been sensible precautions with a purpose at the time. We're now at a stage where 85% of the country has antibodies, either from vaccination or from catching COVID and recovering. But he's identified that 20% of people are still overly anxious about these types of behaviour. They haven't dropped them. And that is what I worry that we're left with. And really, that's the inevitable conclusion of the book. And one of the reasons I would argue that we shouldn't use fear, and one of the reasons it's not ethical, is fear makes recovery harder. This campaign never had an exit strategy. I doubt there still is an exit. I doubt there is an exit strategy. I gather SWYSI haven't met in their entirety as a group until just recently. So that's, where are we? We're in June. Yeah. So all year. Yeah. So they're not talking about an exit strategy as far as I know now. Perhaps different behavioural psychologists advising the government, or perhaps the behavioural insights team. And the other thing is, it was reported in the Telegraph this week that children as young as 5 are having panic attacks about meeting friends, and that 1.5 million children are going to need mental health support in the wake of lockdowns. So there are huge and terrifying, there's huge, terrifying collateral damage. I think it's quite difficult to extricate what might be just as a result of the epidemic, what might be as a result of lockdown, personal impacts like schools closing on children, or the fear messaging through the media or through the government press briefings. It's quite difficult to unpack it all, but that's definitely, I was talking to the psychiatrist who coined this term COVID anxiety syndrome, and he thinks the NHS really needs a recovery plan now. We need a recovery plan for the people who are still locked into an anxious way of thinking and an anxious way of behaving. Oh, and the ONS released figures last month showing that half of all clinically vulnerable people who were shielding are still shielding, even though they're double vaccinated.
Oh, yes. I can quite believe. I suppose that the other side of the coin with behavioural psychology is that you could sort of use it to try to, could you not, to de-frighten people, get them back to work, as it were? I mean, do you think the government would also use those sort of methods to do that, or not?
Well, I think it absolutely should. And when I interviewed anybody who's advising the government, including SPI-B advisors for my book research, I was asking if they'd been tasked yet we're thinking about how to help people climb down from recovery. I know it was not on the agenda. I really hope it is now, but we'll know if it is because the messaging will change. Yeah. So we don't need daily case and death figures announced, certainly not without context. If they start feeding through good news like antibody levels, that the vaccine works, if they start announcing the fact that the Delta variant is actually less lethal, feeding through good news would be an indication that they want fear levels to come down. At the moment, I think what we're seeing is mixed messaging through the media, which will be coming from different sources. Some of that comes from government briefings, and that's a good start. But recovery isn't children having panic attacks about meeting their friends or signs in parks saying COVID is in this park. I've seen that sign not that long ago. Recovery is children playing in playgrounds with each other.
You interviewed, as I say, a lot of people. Are there any particular examples that you can tell us about, where fear has really affected, and in a paralyzing way, some of the people you talked to?
Oh, yes. Some of the people I interviewed it really upset me, actually. It shook me. There was a woman in her 60s who thought she had some physical condition for a long time. Of course, didn't bother her doctor about it. She didn't want to go to the doctor during an epidemic. But she was waking up having panic attacks every day. But she didn't identify they were panic attacks. She thought she had some serious condition, which ultimately improved when she started taking some anti-anxiety medication eventually, and also when she returned to work. But she said that she had to switch off the media because she was checking it for the latest news, and she was actually specifically looking for good news, but there never was any. And she felt overwhelmed by the doom mongering, she called it. A chap called Dave, who was clinically shielding because he's got a couple of conditions, and he and his wife were both shielding together, even though there's nothing wrong with her, because I don't know if you'll remember the advice, but it shows how out of touch sometimes politicians are with how normal people live. The advice was that you shouldn't share the same bathroom.
That's right.
And you should make your meals separately if one of you's shielding and one of you's not. Well, a lot of people don't have an ensuite or two bathrooms, and they don't have a spare kitchen for the staff or space in the one kitchen, Yeah. So she had to shield with him because it's the only way to do it. He eventually left the house after 7 weeks because he had to go to an oncology appointment. And he said he was terrified. He would normally walk to the hospital, but he had to get in his car and drive there because he didn't want to breathe in any air that anyone else had breathed out. So that's in a walk in the fresh air. So you talk about the lady recoiling away from you on the tube. Still, that's how he felt. And the whole experience at the university at the hospital was quite disorientating, obviously. When he arrived, he had to take off his mask and put on a different one, just for extra hygiene. And he thought, wow, this must be serious. I need to change my mask. And chairs were more spaced out and there were dots on the floor. And he was petrified. By the time he got home, he stripped off all his clothes and shoes. He washed his clothes. He threw his shoes away because he couldn't wash them and had a scalding hot bath to get all the COVID off his body. He's fine now. And actually, he's been in touch since he's read the book and said it's been really cathartic for him to be interviewed and to read the book. But what actually got him, what got him over that was when golf courses opened, and his oncologist said, "Look, you're too anxious. I'm going to take you out for a round of golf because it's outside and you'll be safe." And he said, by starting to mix with people, by doing something normal, he just came back into himself. But he said when he and his wife were shielding at home, the only thing to do really was watch TV. And he said it was constant. I quote, boom, boom, boom. He said red graphs and deaths and bad news came at him constantly. So there was no escape. It's almost like a kind of a brainwashing, without me meaning to suggest that there was any concerted attempt to brainwash. But that's what the effect of it was on him.
You mentioned, obviously we've talked a lot about advertising and that sort of area. But what are the other maybe subtler ways in which the nudge impulse is used by the government? Can you explain a few ways? How is it done, actually, Laura?
Yeah, well, there's not as much transparency as I'd like. It would be nice to know exactly what they've done and how, which is why I'd strongly suggest that we need an inquiry. After all, it's our own taxpayers' money that pays for all this to be done to us. There's the advertising. Politicians are given help with their speeches, obviously, with language. We've heard a lot of martial language, evoking images of the war. War gives you the sense that you're doing a battle, but of course it also requires obedience from people, take your bitter medicine. I think the way statistics have been used, and data is another example. As I mentioned before, we've had deaths but not recoveries, hospital admissions but not discharges, and there are other areas of obfuscation within that. So for instance, the hospital admissions figure on the death dashboard, sorry, I call it the death dashboard, the government's COVID dashboard, that's just my shorthand for it. That's quite a misleading figure, because that includes people who've turned up to hospital ill with COVID. It includes people who were already diagnosed with COVID but went in for something else. It includes people who've arrived at hospital for a different condition, then had a routine test and they're found to be positive. And it includes people who went on to catch COVID in hospital. So it's an important number. I'm sure it's a very important number when you're planning beds and capacity and staffing. But it's not telling people what they think it's telling them. They think it's saying how many people have been admitted with COVID, and it isn't. I think sometimes the presentation of the worst case scenarios, and this has been called out in the media now numbers of times. There was a shock and awe presentation by Whitty and Valance last autumn. And just recently there was some modelling that showed that 10,000 people a day would be admitted to hospital with COVID by mid-July. Quite ludicrous projections, really. And while these models are supposed to simulate different scenarios, we tend to focus on the worst case ones, or at least the politicians and the media do, which just breeds more fear. I think that some of the language, it's hard to know exactly where it comes from, but the ultimate effect of it is to encourage social conformity. So the use of COVIDiots and heroes. Recently, in discussing the vaccine, the term refuseniks seemed to suddenly bubble up from nowhere. And then I think as people realised it was horribly inappropriate, just sort of melted away again. Which team do you want to be on? Do you want to be a refusenik, or do you want to take your medicine? Do you want to be a COVIDiot that kills people, or a granny killer? Or are you going to stay at home and do what you're told? There was a select committee with David Halpin, who heads up the Behavioural Insights team, and Stephen Reischer, who's a psychologist who's on SWYSI. And one thing that Stephen Reischer said in that committee was that he'd told the Today programme that they needed to have more stories about heroes. That's people who are doing a good job and doing the right thing, because instead of, it's more carrot and stick. This is how to be a good person in the epidemic. And he said, and then they were very good and they did it. So I think there's probably a little bit of an unofficial hotline between some of the nudgers and some of the journalists, which encourages those kinds of stories, which are about social conformity. You can see lots going on with the vaccine at the moment. So this isn't specifically about fear, but this is where you can see behavioural psychology in full force, from innocuous little vaccine stickers. I got my vaccine. They're on social media or even on lapels in real life. That's quite innocent, quite harmless, but it's to show which team you're on. To incentives. Now, we've never used incentives in this country before. There are lots in the States. Jabs for joints, lap dancing, free beer, free donuts, raffles for college education. They've got it all going on. But I noticed the first one here, which was that Charlton, if I say Charlton Athletic, is that right? I'm not very good with my football teams. Charlton Athletic were hosting vaccinations in their grounds, and the first 1,000 would get free football tickets. So incentives, the use of celebrities and influencers to endorse the vaccine. Don't think they're all going on Instagram posting their selfies off their own back. Some are, some have been asked, some have been paid.
I wonder.
And then I do suspect that some of the talk about vaccine passports and delaying dates, moving goalposts might also be to encourage vaccine uptake. But that's just a sneaking suspicion based on a rather cynical position I've arrived at after researching this for a year.
Well, you've arrived at this position. So from starting from a relatively open-minded one, about it, you've actually, having gone through all of this, basically your attitude now to government is, shall we say, more pragmatic? I mean, would that be the word? It's more cynical.
Yeah, you probably couldn't have found a less cynical person
Yeah.
than Laura in February 2020.
Yeah.
And I'm really cynical now. My trust in government and public health isn't as good as it could be.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe it's in the right place. To be fair, maybe my trust dial's in the right place, and maybe it was too high before. I mean, the thing is, although I couldn't quite get to the bottom of some of the campaigning during COVID, and I think that's because we're in it, we're still in it. It's still too early for the whistleblowers and for the freedom of information to be readily granted. I did speak to somebody who worked for an agency which was employed by the RICU unit. So that's like a counter disinformation unit. What they seek to do is change the attitudes and behaviours of problematic groups, like people that might turn to terrorism. And learning about what they've done was quite shocking. So in the wake of the London Bridge terror incidents, the flowers behind the cordon, some of them might have been left by the great generous British public. Some of them were apparently left by the British government. The hashtags, the graffiti on the wall, these are pre-canned responses. So I interviewed somebody who's penned the propaganda campaigns that are rolled out post-disaster, and somebody who worked for the agency. So what happens is the government unit employs an agency, and then the agency works with grassroots organisations. Sometimes the people who are working on these campaigns have no idea that they're working on a campaign that was instigated by the government.
Right.
That's made me a little cynical.
So you're calling, aren't you, in this book for much more transparency, aren't you? I mean, what other things do you think should happen the thing is, Laura, is it seems to me that, I think you've alluded to it already, but if people have been sort of worked up into fear, which they obviously have, still, if you get people walking along the street with a mask on, young people on their own in an empty street, the government, to be fair, has never actually said they have to do that ever. But such a level has reached that people are doing that. The overall effect of all of this is, well, we can't really judge what it's going to be yet, can we? Because we're still, as you say, in it. But it's not going to be good, is it?
I don't know. There are quite a few things that alarm me. I think we've crossed a number of Rubicons, and we're going to have to see where this goes. I think there's a danger, for instance, that masks stay forever. That's not my vision of the ideal society, but there are other people who like them. I think fair enough if you choose to wear them. But I would like to see the mandate dropped, because they really interfere with communication, with human interaction, with children's development, I'm sure, with people with hearing disabilities. There are so many reasons to get rid of the masks. But Susan Mickey, who is on SPI-B and SAGE and on the Wellcome Trust Behavioural Insights team and on the World Health Organization Behavioural Insights team. So she's really lodged in as a well-known and relied upon behavioural psychologist. She said on Channel 5 News the other week that she thinks we'll have masks forever. So you have to be aware that some of the people who are very instrumental and influential think that these interventions are useful and should stay. She thinks we should always have some measure of social distancing and masks. I've been worried about the potential dehumanising and othering of people, because we had this before, say with gammons, and now we have COVID-idiots and granny killers. If you think back to when pubs reopened last summer, was it July 4th? People went to the pub as they were legally entitled to do, and they'd have done their NHS app and sat or stood where they're supposed to on the dot or the correctly, appropriately spaced table. And yet the media coverage afterwards was horrible. There was a lot of disapproval, and it was a really nasty, sneering disapproval. And there were terms like selfish idiot and COVID-idiot and moron. And I thought, I didn't go to the pub, but I thought it'd be too busy. I don't really like a busy pub. But I thought, crikey, they're only going out and having a drink now, they're legally allowed to. But what that does is create division between people, and it creates factions, and it others, and it dehumanises. So I was quite alarmed when a lot of people were using the term refusenik about vaccines. So there'll be people who can't have the vaccine and people who choose not to. But we don't want to dehumanise them and put them into some silo where they're untouchable, unsafe and unclean. So I think there are some things to watch out for, because that kind of language and trend doesn't tend to play out well in society.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, I think it's a very good point you make, actually, about the disapproval, which there was also a slight class element to that, I have to say, as well. You know, without going, but there was a sort of slight class element to that. You know, just coming right up to date, actually, Laura, you know, obviously we've just seen the G7 summit, and I don't see many journalists going on about, you know, all the leaders, you know, sort of bunched all together, you know, and all of this, and then football VIPs being allowed to come over 2,000. It's slightly making a mockery of the whole thing, I think. But Laura, thank you.
Go on, unleash me. Just let me say something about that, please, because it really bothered me, actually. And it says two powerful things. Like, everyone's focusing, well, those who've spoken out about it, on one rule for me, one rule for you. But it says two other things which I think are more significant. First of all, they don't look terrified for their lives, do they?
No.
No. They are acting as though the threat has abated.
Yeah.
Right. There's no reason why they should feel like that and everyone else shouldn't.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that what they're doing is indulging in completely normal social behaviour. When they think the cameras are off or when they've relaxed a bit, this is how humans behave. And there is nothing wrong with behaving like humans behave.
No, beautifully put. And I totally agree with you. Laura, thank you so much. The book, again, State of Fear by Laura Dodsworth. And you can get it, well, in the bookshops are obviously open, aren't they? But also on Amazon, of course. Laura, thanks once again very much. And all the best with the book. Hope it stays in the bestseller charts. And maybe we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. That's it for So What You're Saying Is this time, and we shall see you in a week's time. Okay, take care. Thank you.